episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show, liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. I think there's a few comments I haven't caught up with yet, so I will do so as soon as possible. So big thank you for everybody that watched last week's episode of the show. According to the YouTube stats, it's the most watched episode of the show within the first week of it being posted up on the site. So obviously there's a lot of you guys out there that love Glenn Guile, and if that's brought along some new subscribers, new viewers, then great to have you. And if you've been watching for donkey's years, then also great to have you. This week's episode of the show, I don't know whether it happens to you guys. Sometimes in life you get a series of what appear to be unconnected events that sort of lead you to a certain end point. I'm probably making very little sense, but over the last few weeks I received a number of samples from viewers and friends, as I often have a tendency to do, so thank you very much for that. I got two samples of 28-year-old Tormore, both independent bottlings, from independents that I don't pretty much don't come across, to be honest with you. And then a couple of weeks later, the news broke that Elixir Distillers had agreed to purchase the Tormore distillery from the current owners, Shivers or Pernod Ricard, as the case may be. And I just thought, ooh, this is all a bit sort of a bit spooky. This is obviously means that I have to do an episode of the show on Tormore. And probably a lot of you are going, who? What? Never heard of them. And well, why should you? They're not exactly one of the most well-known of distilleries, and like a number of distilleries that have been built over the years, its sole purpose was to produce whiskey for the blending industry, or for the blenders. And to be honest with you, the current owners, or soon to be ex-owners, never really did an awful lot with it. There was no necessity to do so. For a long time, the only official distillery release was a 10-year-old, which frankly was as dull as ditch water. It was caramel flattened, it was dull, it was, I mean, even underneath all the caramel, there was only really a kind of innocuous kind of spay, I suppose. And rightly or wrongly, Tormore has always been seen as a bit of a filler malt. Now, I'm not being disingenuous to it, but I mean, not every distillery can be sort of, what's the word, characterful, I suppose. The industry needs these fillers to do that job. And some of them do that job particularly well. I mean, like I said, Tormore, I've often found to be, well, like a lot of filler malts, not sort of doing an awful lot, but like some, for example, one that springs to mind is Imperial. I always used to love Imperial, certainly at a young age, and quite exuberant, and but again could be quite bland. Over time, given time in the oak, sometimes would develop this lovely, rich, honeyed character. So that got me thinking about today's episode of the show. Does Tormore do exactly the same thing? Is it sort of a bit of a bland, innocuous Speyside whiskey? Does it actually gain any real character when in the cask and given a bit of time? So that's the kind of the raison d'etre, I suppose, for today's episode of the show. And so, although a lot of you are probably going, well, I've never really heard of Tormore, like I said, the distillery isn't exactly well known, but it actually does have quite an intriguing history to a certain extent, and it's quite a statement sort of building, really. As there's people that love it and people that don't, and I'm going to quote Dave Broom, because I think he kind of absolutely sort of nailed what the distillery looks like, and he says, the massive Tormore distillery sits boldly beside the A96, looking like a modernist homage to a Victorian hydropathic hotel. It said it was designed by Sir Albert Richardson, President of the Royal Academy, who for all his qualities as an architect had clearly never built a distillery in his life, when he was commissioned by Long John Distilleries in 1959. And like I said, absolutely, I think there's got it spot on it. You can see from the title picture, I kind of left it deliberately plain, so you can kind of see that, and it really does look like a Victorian hotel. So yeah, okay, it's a pretty much a statement building, and really it kind of is fitting, I suppose, considering who actually built the distillery, or who commissioned the distillery. It was a chap called Louis Rosenstiel, who in the 1920s in America founded Shenley Industries, and basically wanted to be the big cheese of American and Scottish whisky, and started up buying distilleries and all this kind of thing. He also purchased a license to distill medicinal alcohol during Prohibition, and of course this brought him into contact, or should we say more than contact, with another one of the big cheeses of American whisky, Samuel Brompham of Seagram's. And apparently the Rosenstiel was a bit of a kind of, well, not exactly the most lovable of characters. Apparently had quite a big temper, and some of the arguments and encounters between him and Bronfman allegedly go down in history, shall we say, and sometimes they turned rather quite unpleasant. But anyway, so Rosenstiel basically was attempting to become, like I said, the big cheese of American whiskey distilling, and reading about these guys, it seems like the whiskey industry was almost run like mafia cartels at the time. Certainly, Rosenstiel was investigated on more than one occasion by the FBI into alleged bootlegging and black market profiteering, and incidentally he was investigated in the late 1950s by the assistant director of the FBI, a chap called Lewis Nichols, and he basically during the sort of investigations said, he conspires with sort of well-known black market operators, to which Rosenstiel basically said, they're my distributors. Lovely bunch. So the investigation obviously continued, but it turns out that this Rosenstiel is big pals with the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, donates money to the Hoover Foundation, all that kind of stuff. So you can pretty much bet that nothing was going to happen, and indeed it didn't. And the ironic twist in all of this is that Nichols allegedly became the vice president of Shenley in 1957. It's called keeping your enemies close, isn't it? So anyway, the Tormore Distillery, built in 1959, was actually constructed to provide malt for Shenley's Long John blend. I mean, I've never tasted it, to be honest with you, which he acquired in 1956 when he took over Cigar Evans. And it's quite ironic again, the fact that the Long John blend was allegedly created by a chap called Long John MacDonald, and he was apparently a notorious Scottish bootlegger who apparently allegedly went legit in 1825 and built Ben Nevis. But it's like are we saying that sort of the early sort of 1800s and sort of early 1900s was full of, shall we say, dodgy characters? But anyway, so coming back to the distillery, a really intriguing history. I mean, maybe the distillery itself doesn't have a particularly intriguing history, but certainly the characters surrounding it. And that's one of the wonderful things about the whiskey industry, that we tend to forget that it was built by these real characters back in the day. But like I said, the whole reason for today's episode of the show is to basically discover whether this filler malt actually does become complex, does it become interesting when, you know, it's spent some years in the cask. I mean, I believe that after I think it was about, what, 2010, 12, something like that, the old 10-year-old distillery bottling was replaced by a 14-year-old. Never tasted that, never felt the real desire to do so. And incidentally, the Whisky Exchange have actually got a bottle of the old 10-year-old on their website, and they want 150 quid for it. For that? Oh, scary stuff. But anyway, I digress. So that's a little bit of potted history of the distillery and the Victorian Hotel. So I don't think there's much else to say apart from let's have a look at today's lineup. Right, okay, so I scoured my boxes and came up with a few other bottlings of Tormore, and to go with the two that I received fairly recently. So the first one we're going to kick off with is a Douglas Laing Old Malt Cask. That shows you how old that particular bottling is. It was a single refill bourbon hoggy, DL9036, distilled in June of 1995, bottled in September of 2012 at 50%, making it 17 years old. Bottling number 2 is a Dewar Rattray individual cask bottling. It's an 18-year-old bourbon hoggy, again 292, distilled in June of 1995, bottled in January of 2014 at 49.8. Number 3 is a 26-year-old, so a bit of a leap up. This is a Mackillop's Choice bottling from April 1988, which was bottled in July of 2015. Again, single bourbon cask number 4176, bottled at 55.6%. Now we come on to the two bottlings that kind of like kick-started this episode of the show, for want of a better word. This came from a friend viewer, Christopher Channing, I think that's your surname. If I've got that wrong, I do apologise. So this is a Chorlton Whisky Tormore, and not a bottling company that I have any dealings with at all, so very rarely get to taste anything that they've bottled. This is a 28-year-old, distilled in November of 1992, bottled in July of 2021 at 42.4%. And on to the second of the two 28-year-olds. This came my way from my good friend in Sunderland, so thank you very much for that. This is a Thompson Brothers bottling. Again, an independent bottling company that I don't come across very often. Again, distilled in 1992, don't know the exact month, but bottled in 2021 at 47.3%, and as far as I'm aware, a refill bourbon hoggy. And the last bottling we'll be looking at is an Additions Spirits First Edition bottling. It's a 29-year-old, distilled in November of 1988, bottled in 2018, bottled at 44.9%, originally aged in a refill bourbon hoggy before being sherry finished. Now, it does make you wonder why you're going to sherry finish quite an old whisky. We'll hopefully find that one out. The cask number was HL15351. So quite some mature whiskies. Hopefully they'll be intriguing and answer the question as to whether Tormore does get interesting with age. So let's kick off with the Old Malt Cask bottle. Right, okay, so 17-year-old Tormore, bottled at 50%. Let's see whether those gives us on this end, shall we? Quite a lot of oak, which is actually fairly unusual by Douglas Laing standards. I mean, alright, that's being a bit blanket, but I remember a lot of the Douglas Laing bottlings tending to be quite light on the oak. They love their refill casks. But this has actually got quite a lot of creamy oak, a little bit of grass, a little bit of white fruit. There's a bit of an alcohol prickle. It's pretty simple, pleasant. There's some fruit. There's sort of maybe some slightly fleshy apricot, maybe a little bit of banana. I mean, it's certainly, you know, considerably better than the old Distillery bottle 10-year-old, because there's obviously no caramel clogging it up. But yeah, it's pleasant. I mean, it's not sort of, you know, mind-blowing, but it's certainly not a poor nose, shall we say. So pass on. It pretty much like the nose. A lot of oak, butterscotch, toffee, a little bit of citrus, which is kind of adding balance. Obviously, the 50% ABV is quite noticeable in actual fact. Certainly on the mid palate, medium-ish kind of length, a little bit of grass, a little bit of fruit. It's a little bit of everything, I suppose. It's not, apart from the oak being the sort of most obvious character of that, it's not really standing out in a sort of huge manner, but it is pleasant. And like I said, it kind of reminds me of Imperial. You know, Imperial was never a mind-blowing whiskey, certainly not at a young age, but it was pleasant. And the thing is that, like I said, the blending industry needs this kind of stuff. Maybe not this particular cask, because it's a bit too much cask orientated, but certainly it's a pleasant bottling. Right, okay, so let's move on to the AD Rattray 18-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? That's quite rich, quite dense. It's got an almost kind of refill sherry feel to it in actual fact, and it's got some dried fruit, a little bit of vanilla, apricot, toffee. There's quite an edge to it, not an industrial edge, but sort of like a citric edge. And again, although the ABV isn't exactly that high, the alcohol is again noticeable, and it's adding to that kind of balancing, crisper, sort of enhancing the citric notes, to be honest with you. Again, it's not exactly what you'd call sort of overtly complex, but again, it's a pleasant nose. It's certainly showing some age. That sort of refilly sherry character is starting to become a little bit more like oxidative dried fruit, which I'm guessing is the time it's spent in the cask. So yeah, okay, you can argue that there's a little bit more complexity than the Douglas Laing bottling. So pass on. Got the spicy finish. I mean, again, the alcohol is kind of, it's not masking the finish per se, but it's not particularly long. It's medium length, I suppose. Lovely spiciness, though, it has to be said. The oak has added that lovely spiciness to it. Again, pretty straightforward stuff. Got some good fruit, some apricot, a little bit of grass, white fruit. Bit of tannins on the mid palate. It is a little drying on the finish. The sort of the alcohol, the tannins are kind of shortening it a little bit. It's got a lovely aftertaste though, touch of honey. So yeah, again, you know, a pleasant whiskey, not exactly earth-shattering in its complexity, but certainly not a bad whiskey at all. I mean, when this was released, what, in 2014, it would have been a damn sight cheaper than what an 18-year-old whiskey would have been today. So yeah, pleasant. Right, okay, so let's move on to the 26-year-old and Mackillop's choice. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Again, there's quite a chunk of oak, toffee. So even a little bit, I swear I'm getting a little bit of grist, which I shouldn't be at this kind of age. It's got some lovely honey. I mean, it really has got a lovely depth to it. It's fuller, slightly tropical, but a lot of buttery, creamy oak again, and yeah, it's a lovely nose. It has to be said. You know, you can't knock it. Again, possibly a little bit sort of too much oak, maybe, and not a great deal of spirit, but yeah, it's got some lovely spices. I'm getting ginger spice now. No, not ginger, gingery spice. Not having ginger spice sort of suddenly jump out of the glass at me. Yeah, okay, not exactly overly complex again, but nice maturity. Let's see what the parts are. A little bit like the AD Rattray bottling. Lots of lush, soft toffee, honey. I mean, that really has got a big gob of honey. Barley, lovely spiciness. I mean, the finish is just tingling away quite merrily with that sort of gingery kind of note lingering. Again, pretty simple stuff, you know. It really doesn't progress very much. It kind of like opens up with oak and a little bit of spirit and just kind of carries on in that kind of vein. But it's got a lovely mouthfeel, lovely richness to it. Again, that's the sort of like the development of the honey, the oxidation, and obviously the sort of like chunky creamy oak as well, which gives it that lovely mouthfeel and really lovely spicy finish. So I mean, yeah, lovely whiskey. Again, not a hugely complex bottling. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Chorlton Whisky Tormore. Let's see what the nose gives on this end, shall we? Right, so this is the first one that doesn't sort of overtly hit you with oak. So again, it's quite a noticeable alcohol prickle, even though this is only 42.4. Quite citric, lime, almost high-toned, crunchy barley. A little bit of American oak, but not a great deal. Again, it's kind of like, you know, sitting in the sort of lighter citric end of the space spectrum. Yeah, there's a bit of underripe green fruit. Yeah, I mean, it's a pleasant nose. It's not earth-shattering by any means, but you know, not unpleasant. Let's see what that goes. It's a bit bland, citric, a little bit of white fruit, some tangerine. There's no oak there whatsoever. It's kind of, well, I suppose you could argue with it leaves the kind of spirit exposed, but it then kind of exposes the fact that it's not a particularly complex spirit. It's a bit bland. There's no real honey to it. There's maybe a little bit of toffee. Again, that alcohol is quite noticeable. I mean, it's not masking, but you know, the alcohol is definitely there. And it seems to me that there isn't really any kind of counterbalance there. It's like I said, the oak is practically non-existent, and so you're just getting all of the spirit character. Now, I don't think this was a particularly cheap bottling. It's not bad bottling, but it does actually show up the, I suppose you could argue, the limitations of the spirit. The fact that there isn't particularly complex, and it feels a lot younger than 28. To be honest with you, it doesn't seem to have really gathered an awful lot of time, anything from being in the cask for that length of time. I imagine that the cask was pretty well used because there's no cask notes. Maybe there was a bit on the nose, but certainly not a great deal on the palate. And although I wouldn't call it a disappointing bottling, like I said, it shows up obviously the limitations of the spirit. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Thompson Brothers Tormore. Again, 28 years old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end. Now, this does smell quite old. Straw-like, a bit dried out, a little bit of orange blossom honey, some barley, a little bit of sawdusty American oak. I mean, I guess this is what I would expect expect the nose to be like at 28 years old. I would expect that mature oak note to be quite noticeable. A little bit of nuttiness, a little bit of marzipan, but it does feel quite old. And I guess if you're starting off with a spirit that really doesn't have a huge amount of character, by the time it starts to get to this kind of age, it's kind of losing some of it. And if it's not gaining anything from being in the cask, and again, not a huge amount of oak character, a little bit of marzipan, like I said, a little bit of sort of almond skin. Yeah, I mean, it's okay. This was, I think, quite an expensive bottling, and I must admit, I mean, I wouldn't say disappointed by it, but again, I suppose you have to sort of look at it and think, well, I know what Tormore is like, you know. But anyway, let's see what passes on. Well, it starts off quite pleasant. There's that slightly honeyed character, but it kind of goes really downhill from there. It starts to become a little bit creaky. It's old. There's a little bit of cardboard. It's short. It's fairly astringent. Again, that alcohol is noticeable. I mean, well, only 47.3, but it kind of is definitely, and that does seem to be an overriding characteristic of Tormore. Quite alcoholic, or the alcohol seems to be quite sort of noticeable. Doesn't really have a great deal on the finish, to be honest with you, and it feels to me like this has just been left too long in the cask. It's kind of quite ironic, really, isn't it? You know, how different two casks of exactly the same age can be. But they do certainly share a commonality in the fact that they don't have an awful lot of oak character. They definitely left the spirit kind of hanging there, and like I said, it has shown up the limitations of the spirit at this kind of age. So yeah, not a bad bottling, but not exactly earth-shattering. Right, okay, so let's move on to the final bottling of the afternoon. This is the Edition Spirits 29-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Right, well, that's got plenty of oxidation character, intense dried fruit, touch of earth, almost a manure-y kind of note. Wouldn't quite say dirty, but manure-y. The Oloroso is quite gritty. Again, there's a disconnect here, that the spirit is a little bit cardboardy, a bit too old. I'm not being disingenuous to Edition Spirits, but I think this was dumped into a sherry cask for an obvious reason. I think it had basically become too old, and it was a case of we need to do something with it. And I know some people may well say I'm being a bit harsh on it, but I know how people think. I know how bottling companies work. I mean, you know, these things do happen from time to time, and it's not unheard of for, you know, whiskey to be decanted into other casks to kind of, you know, either mask certain attributes or give it some character. And I think, to be bluntly honest with you, this has been dumped into sherry to kind of mask the fact that it's too old and really has run its course. It's getting a little bit like sweaty socks now. It really is. Yeah, seriously creaking. Let's see what the parts are. Dead as a dodo. It really is creaked. It's kind of raw nothingness. It's kind of rose petals and cardboard. It's really fallen off its perch, it has to be said. Personally, I wouldn't have bottled that. It's certainly, the sherry cask has done absolutely nothing for it whatsoever, and it's just indicative of buyer beware with old spirits. Not every spirit has got the characteristics to sort of to age 20, 30, 40 odd years. You know, it just doesn't happen. And when you are paying sort of, you know, fairly hefty price tag for old whiskey, it's, as I keep saying, you know, there are these huge pitfalls, and you know, it's a shame, but you know, these things happen. And that one, unfortunately, like I said, should have probably been bottled a long time before it actually was. Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show. Well, interesting. I think it's kind of certainly proved the point to me that that Tormore is a fairly well, it's a filler malt. It's fairly simplistic, and it seems to me that it's at its best somewhere between about sort of 17 and 20 odd years of age. Once it starts to get beyond sort of 20, you're into kind of like difficult territory. It's obviously not got the sort of the character or the cojones to kind of age that long, and that's not, you know, that's not sort of a criticism of the distillery whatsoever. It's just obviously every whiskey, every cask, every distillery, that they have their sort of, you know, à point points in their life. For some distilleries and some whiskies, they are further down the line than others. That's just the way it is. So the Douglas Laing 17-year-old, yeah, pleasant whiskey, you know, yeah, it had quite a lot of oak, and that added something other to the spirit than it being just sort of like fairly kind of bland. And to a certain extent, the AD Rattray bottling as well had some. It felt a little bit older than what it probably was. Had some nice oxidation character. It was a lovely whiskey. But again, you know, the spirit was never going to be anything other than what it actually was. And the same could be said for the Mackillop's Choice Tormore. Again, not a bad cask. You know, plenty of oak, and you know, showed sort of like that. You know, it can be a pleasant whiskey. You know, it's not an unpleasant whiskey whatsoever. Where we started to go downhill a little bit was obviously the Chorlton Whisky Tormore. It didn't have enough oak character at all, and obviously the same could be said to a certain extent for the Thompson Brothers bottling. Again, not enough oak. It kind of left the spirit kind of exposed, and it exposed its limitations. And the fact is that by this point in its aging, it was starting to become a little bit too old. Obviously, the Chorlton whisky bottling wasn't as pronounced in that creakiness that the Thompson Brothers bottling was, but and certainly, you know, when we got to the addition of spirits, it was certainly falling off its peg, and so it's kind of obviously to me saying that Tormore has a definite shelf life. You know, bottle it before it gets too old. You know, 20 odd. Or some early 20s is probably about as far as you want to push Tormore, because once it gets beyond that, it starts to become a little bit creaky, and you know, and we end up in that kind of situation. So yeah, it certainly does have a similarity with a number of these filler whiskies. Certainly, like I said, comparisons with Imperial are not. Are definitely there, and like I said, Imperial could do exactly the same. I mean, I loved Imperial, but yeah, you wouldn't want to push Imperial too far, because again, it would creak and groan and fall off its perch, because it just doesn't have the complexity. But get it at its right point, you have, you know, a pleasant whiskey. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode of the show. I think it's been a lot of fun. Any comments I have made in this episode of the show are wholly my own and have no bearing or relevance to the company that employs me, just to make certain. So, you know, if you are going to complain at me, complain to me, not the company, because this has nothing to do with it. Anyway, so that's this week's episode of the show in the bag. Don't seem to have an awful lot of juice left in the glasses. So all that's left to say is good afternoon and Good granny.